all that and make this really useful, sophisticated, integrated product. So that's the operational mystery. And in terms of success, we also have the success mystery that says, why do some of these projects succeed while others fail? I mean, we recognize that there's no more than 5% of these projects actually produce any useful result. And again, because this is new and because these are so different, we really don't have a good handle on that. So these are the mysteries that have motivated this work. Now, specifically, our specific research objective for this dissertation is to address the success mystery. And that's why we're addressing community success. We're using social network structure as a way of addressing it because there's been so much research to show that social network structures do make a difference in various kinds of social and organizational outcomes. And it's a very rich kind of a measure. So we're using social network perspective. We address the success mystery to see if we can shed some light on it by doing this first large-scale study of open source projects. But there's really a broader motivation, and kind of our broader research objective is, we're really intrigued by this whole situation. This really seems like something fundamentally new. What does it mean? Where could it go from here? There's been a great deal of speculation in the literature about the idea that open source models and principles and methods might be extended beyond software. They can be applied to developing drugs and creating airliners, and there's all sorts of ideas about how this might be extended. But all of that speculation is very abstract. And we've yet to see any really concrete ideas that say, this is what the open source model is, this is what it is not. So where are those boundaries? And then where can you apply that model? So we're hoping to shed some light on that as well as we address the success mystery. Maybe we can begin to address these mysteries. And we suspect there might be some fundamental organizing principles for open source. And we may know we've got those if we find an answer that kind of addresses all three mysteries. So if we can do that, we may have begun to define what that model is, which can lead us towards this idea of a more general model that can be applied beyond software. So that's kind of the ulterior motive here, but again, the direct approach of the research is to address success. Okay, so our research model, the actual scope of the research, as you see, is within the dotted box. So we are trying to measure and relate social network structure. And again, we use these three fundamental types of social network structure: closure, bridging, and leader centrality. And we relate those to success of the project community. Now you can see we measure success and we conceptualize it as both output and activity. Output is basically the quantity of software produced by the community. So we measure that in two ways. We measure it in terms of how many code commits have happened. Basically what happens as developers write source code, periodically batches of code gets committed or placed into the source code repository. So every time that happens, that's counted. That's considered one commit. And those are counted. So that's kind of an intermediate work product, how many code commits there are. The other measurement of output is how many software releases there are. So what happens is periodically the administrator will look at that source code repository and make a decision, okay, it's time now to compile it, create a new version that we release to the public that can be now executable on people's computers, and that's considered a software release. And this would be where you might see version 1.0, 1.01, 1.02, that's the idea of a software release. So that's the idea of output. Now activity is basically the quantity of participation of the community. And we measure that in two ways. One is we count how many times that software that was released is downloaded. So if you want to use the new version, you have to go and you have to download it from the project website. And so we're counting that as a measure of activity of the community. And we also, under activity, measure basically number of page hits or online viewing and browsing for the project web pages. So how many times those project web pages are being looked at is also a measure of activity. And you can see we do have the dual arrows, so we recognize that there's a reciprocal relationship here. So to some extent, the greater the output, more software produced, that will tend to lead to more activity, more downloading, more viewing. And if there's more activity and, say, more interest in the project, then that may lead to more output, more development of software. So we recognize these two are related, even though we do measure them and treat them separately in the Now, within the scope of the research, we also recognize there are some mediating factors that might affect this relationship. For example, the size of the group, the type of the project, the type of the task involved, the norms of the community. For example, think of those corporate sponsored projects. Probably there's different norms involved there, so that may be a mediating factor. Maturity of the project. The kinds of structures that are relevant in an early stage project might be different than what we might see in a very mature project. So what we do in the research, we do try as much as possible to control for those factors. And I'll describe the study population definition where we do, for example, eliminate corporate sponsors. So we want to try to get a more pure, homogeneous study population. And we also focus in on the early stage projects, so we try to control for maturity and so forth. And I'll describe that shortly. So that's within the scope of the research. Now, external to the research would be external impacts. So these are things that you might think of as success, but these are things that happen outside the boundary of the community. For example, if the software that's produced by the community is accepted as an industry standard, that would be something external. Or maybe, once the community has shut down and basically they're done and they're not working anymore, maybe continued usage of the software would be kind of an external impact. We recognize, that happens, but it is outside of our scope. Market factors, which primarily affect that, are also outside the scope. So we're really looking at what goes on inside here and output activity in the project community. Okay, now just to talk a little bit about social network theory before I get into talking about the propositions. There's basically two different sort of paradigms of social network theory that says, why do social networks even matter? And the first one at the top here says, that social networks are seen to be a kind of conduit for the flow of information and knowledge. So what that says is, for example, if we can imagine a social network in this room, where the network is defined by who gives advice to who. So to the extent that perhaps Professor Lee gives advice